October 14th, 1978. 3:47 p.m., Gate 23, Sheremetyevo International Airport, Moscow. A woman in the crisp blue uniform of Aeroflot smoothed her skirt, checked her lipstick in a compact mirror, and walked past two KGB officers without a second glance. They didn't look at her either. She was furniture, background, a flight attendant preparing for the evening service to East Berlin, one of thousands who moved through Soviet airspace every week, carrying trays and pillows and practiced smiles. Except the compact mirror in her handbag contained a microfilm canister. The lipstick tube held a one-time pad cipher, and the woman herself, Lyudmila Konstantin Petrova, was about to board a flight that would make her the most valuable penetration asset the KGB had placed inside Western intelligence networks in a decade. Not because she was brilliant, not because she was ideologically pure, but because no one, not the CIA, not MI6, not even the BND, thought to look twice at the woman serving coffee at 30,000 feet. The question that haunts every counterintelligence officer is this: how do you hide a spy in plain sight? The answer the KGB discovered in the late 1970s was elegant in its simplicity. You don't create elaborate legends or forge decades of backstory. You don't embed them in universities or diplomatic corps where every credential gets scrutinized. You place them in a job so ordinary, so gender-coded, so thoroughly dismissed by the security apparatus of the time, that the very act of occupying that role becomes the disguise. Flight attendants moved across borders constantly. They had access to secure areas without suspicion. They interacted with businessmen, diplomats, military officers, journalists. They were young, attractive, forgettable, and in the Cold War's obsessive focus on male handlers and male assets, on the great game played by men in gray suits, the women in blue uniforms became invisible. The KGB didn't just exploit this blindness, they systematized it. To understand how Lyudmila Petrova became what CIA files would later call the stewardess problem, you have to go back to 1973, to a KGB planning session in a nondescript building on Lubyanka Square. The first chief directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence, was facing a crisis. Western counterintelligence had gotten better. The old methods, diplomatic cover, illegal residence with deep legends, academic placements, were burning out. The CIA's counterintelligence chief, James Angleton, had spent years hunting moles, and while his paranoia had crippled the agency in some ways, it had also made traditional penetration operations nearly impossible. The KGB needed vectors that didn't trigger the standard tripwires. They needed people who could cross borders without diplomatic immunity, who could make contact without surveillance teams noticing, who could carry materials without cavity searches or diplomatic pouch protocols. Someone proposed airline personnel, not pilots, too visible, too tracked, not ground crew, too limited in range, flight attendants. Specifically, Aeroflot flight attendants on international routes. Aeroflot wasn't just an airline, it was a state instrument. Every employee underwent vetting. Every international crew member had a security file. The KGB already had informants throughout the airline, reporting on passenger conversations, monitoring defection risks, ensuring ideological compliance. But what if, instead of just monitoring, they recruited? What if they trained certain flight attendants not as casual informants, but as operational assets? Women who could carry messages, make brush passes in airport terminals, assess recruitment targets during flights, even conduct honey trap operations in hotel bars during layovers. The proposal went up the chain. By early 1974, it had approval. The program was codenamed Operation Skyline. Lyudmila Petrova was in the first training class. She was 23 years old when the KGB approached her. Born in Leningrad, daughter of a factory foreman and a school teacher, she had joined Aeroflot in 1972 after graduating from a technical institute with a degree in foreign languages. She spoke fluent English and passable German. She was attractive in a way that photographs described as approachable, not so beautiful that she stood out, but pleasant enough to be memorable if needed. Her file showed no political deviations, no foreign contacts, no family complications. Her father had died in 1970. Her mother lived quietly in a communal apartment. Ludmila herself had a boyfriend, an engineer, but the relationship was casual. She was, in the assessment of her recruiters, malleable, ambitious enough to want more than a flight attendant's salary, intelligent enough to handle operational complexity. And crucially, she had something many KGB officers lacked. She genuinely enjoyed talking to strangers. The recruitment happened in stages. First, a casual conversation with a personnel officer about opportunities for special service to the state. Then a formal interview at a building she was told was part of the Ministry of Civil Aviation. Then a psychological assessment disguised as a career aptitude test. By the time she understood she was being recruited by the KGB, she had already passed 3 levels of vetting. The final pitch came from a woman, a major in the 2nd Directorate, who explained it simply. Ludmila would continue her work as a flight attendant. She would receive additional training in observation, communication, and operational security. On certain flights, she would be given tasks. Small things at first. Delivering a package, noting which passengers spoke to each other, reporting on crew conversations. In exchange, she would receive a supplemental salary, access to special stores, and the knowledge that she was serving the Soviet Union in ways most citizens could never imagine. Ludmila said yes, not because of ideology, though she dutifully mouthed the correct phrases about socialist duty, but because it was interesting, because it made her feel chosen. The training lasted 6 months. It took place in a dacha outside Moscow, disguised as an advanced customer service course. There were 12 women in the program, all Aeroflot crew, all flying international routes. They learned dead drop procedures, how to use concealment devices, modified cosmetics cases, hollowed-out heels, false-bottomed luggage, how to conduct surveillance detection routes in foreign cities during layovers, how to assess recruitment targets, what to listen for, what questions to ask, how to report personality profiles. They practiced brush passes in crowded airport terminals until the movements became muscle memory. They studied recognition signals, folded newspapers, specific magazine covers, colored shopping bags. They memorized one-time pad encryption for emergency communications, and they learned the cardinal rule: never deviate from your cover. You are a flight attendant. You smile. You serve drinks. You complain about jet lag and difficult passengers. You flirt harmlessly. You are exactly what you appear to be, except for the 15 seconds when you're not. Ludmila's first operational assignment came in August 1974. Aeroflot Flight 341, Moscow to Paris. A French businessman in seat 12A, traveling alone, had been flagged by KGB analysts as a potential access agent, someone who might, with the right approach, provide information about his employer, a defense contractor with NATO ties. Ludmila's task was simple: engage him in conversation, assess his receptiveness, report back. She served him champagne. She mentioned she was studying French. She asked about Paris, about his work, about whether he traveled often. He was friendly, mildly flirtatious, and talked freely about his company's expansion into telecommunications. Ludmila smiled, refilled his glass, and filed a detailed report when she returned to Moscow. The businessman was approached 6 months later by a KGB officer posing as a trade representative. The recruitment succeeded. Ludmila had done her job perfectly, and no one had noticed. Over the next 4 years, she ran dozens of similar operations. Most were low-level. Message drops in airport bathrooms, passing sealed envelopes to contacts in hotel lobbies, photographing documents left briefly unattended in first-class cabins. Occasionally, the tasks escalated. In 1976, she was assigned to assess an American journalist who flew Moscow-London regularly. She sat next to him on 3 consecutive flights, built rapport, learned about his sources, his frustrations with his editors, his drinking habits. Her reports helped the KGB determine he was vulnerable to compromise. In 1977, she carried a microdot sewn into her uniform jacket from East Berlin to Moscow, containing technical specifications for a NATO communications system that a Stasi source had photographed. The jacket went through X-ray. No one looked twice. She was a flight attendant. She was supposed to be there. But what made Ludmila especially valuable wasn't just her operational discipline. It was her ability to exploit the assumptions baked into Cold War security culture. Western intelligence services in the 1970s were almost entirely male at the operational level. Women worked as secretaries, translators, analysts, support roles. The idea that a woman could be a trained intelligence operative, running her own operations, was intellectually acknowledged, but practically dismissed. Flight attendants were even further down the threat matrix. They were seen as potential security risks in terms of defection. Airlines monitored crew for signs of flight risk, but not as active threats. The assumption was that if the KGB used airline personnel, it would be pilots or navigators, people with access to cockpit communications or flight plans. Flight attendants served drinks. They were scenery. This blindness was structural. Airport security in the 1970s focused on hijacking prevention and customs enforcement, not counterintelligence. Diplomatic personnel got scrutinized. Journalists got followed. Businessmen from sensitive industries got flagged. But airline crew moved through expedited channels. They had crew badges. They bypassed normal passport control. In many airports, they entered through separate doors, walked separate corridors, and were subject to minimal screening because they were presumed to be vetted by their employers. For Aeroflot crew, this was doubly true. Western authorities assumed Soviet airline personnel were already under KGB control, which meant they were watched for defection attempts, but not for operational activity. The irony was perfect. The very fact that everyone knew Aeroflot was a KGB front made individual crew members less suspicious, not more. They were part of the scenery of Cold War air travel, as unremarkable as the Cyrillic safety cards and the smell of cabbage from the galley. Ludmila understood this instinctively. She played the role with precision. She gossiped with other flight attendants about passengers and layovers. She complained about the quality of the coffee and the rudeness of the pilots. She dated occasionally, always men pre-approved by her handlers. She maintained the appearance of a woman whose biggest concern was whether her lipstick matched her uniform. And beneath that performance, she ran an operational calendar that would have impressed a case officer. She knew which flights had surveillance, which airports had the best dead-drop locations, which hotel bars in which cities were frequented by which categories of targets. She kept it all in her head. She never wrote anything down. She was, in the assessment of her KGB handlers, a natural. By 1978, she had been promoted within the program. She was now running her own subsources, 2 other flight attendants she had recruited, women who fed her information about passengers and crew that she synthesized and reported. She had been given a coveted route, Moscow to West Berlin, with layovers that allowed her to service dead drops in both East and West sectors. And she had been assigned a new task, one that marked her transition from support asset to operational agent. She was to make contact with a CIA officer. The target was identified only by a code name in her briefing, Compass. CIA files later revealed him as Thomas Brennan, a case officer working under commercial cover in West Berlin, posing as a sales representative for an American machinery company. The KGB had been tracking him for months. They knew his patterns, his meeting sites, his brush pass locations. But they needed confirmation of his identity and, if possible, a way to feed him information that would lead him into a trap. Ludmila's role was to engineer a seemingly accidental encounter, assess his receptiveness, and, if the opportunity arose, plant the seed for future contact. The meeting was set for October 15, 1978, in the bar of the Hotel Am Zoo in West Berlin during her layover. She prepared meticulously. Her cover story was simple. She was killing time before her return flight, practicing her English, enjoying a drink in a Western hotel because Soviet hotels were depressing. She wore civilian clothes, not her uniform, too obvious. She carried a British fashion magazine as a recognition signal. She arrived at the bar at 8:30 p.m., ordered a glass of wine, and waited. Brennan arrived at 8:47 p.m. He sat 2 stools away. He ordered bourbon. Ludmila glanced at him, smiled briefly, and returned to her magazine. He glanced back. She waited 3 minutes, then asked in accented English if he had a light. He did. They started talking. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. She told him she was a flight attendant, that she flew for Aeroflot, that she loved seeing Western cities even if the layovers were short. He told her he was in sales, that he traveled constantly, that Berlin was interesting but exhausting. She asked what he sold. He gave a vague answer about industrial equipment. She laughed and said she didn't understand business. She just liked talking to people. He bought her another drink. She asked if he came to this hotel often. He said sometimes. She said maybe they'd run into each other again. He said maybe. They exchanged first names. She used her real one. He used his cover name. Then she checked her watch, said she had an early flight, and left. The entire interaction looked like a mild flirtation between strangers in a hotel bar. Ludmila filed her report the next day. Brennan filed his own report, noting a pleasant conversation with a Russian flight attendant who seemed curious about the West, but not overtly political. Neither of them knew the KGB had photographed the entire encounter from a room across the street. What happened next was a masterclass in patient operational development. Ludmila didn't contact Brennan again immediately. The KGB let 3 months pass. Then, in January 1979, she accidentally encountered him again, this time in the lobby of a different hotel in West Berlin. She expressed surprise and delight. They had coffee. She mentioned she was thinking about defecting, not seriously, just a fantasy, the kind of thing people said when they were tired of the Soviet system. Brennan's report noted the comment, but assessed her as low priority, a disgruntled flight attendant, possibly genuine, possibly a dangle, not worth the risk. The KGB read his report. They had a source inside the Berlin station and adjusted. Over the next 6 months, Ludmila ran into Brennan 4 more times. Each encounter was brief, plausibly coincidental, and carefully scripted to deepen his sense that she was a potential walk-in, someone who might eventually provide information or even defect but who needed to be handled delicately. By mid-1979, Brennan had reported her to his superiors as a possible development target. The CIA's assessment was cautious. She fit the profile of a genuine defector in place. Young, access to travel, expressed dissatisfaction, no obvious red flags. But she was also exactly the kind of person the KGB would use as bait. The decision was made to pursue contact, but with extreme caution. Brennan was authorized to continue the relationship, to assess her motivations, and to determine if she had access to anything of value. He was explicitly instructed not to recruit her, not to offer her anything, and not to take any action that could be construed as espionage unless she volunteered information first. It was a textbook defensive posture. It was also exactly what the KGB had anticipated. The trap was sprung in November 1979. Ludmila, during a layover in West Berlin, told Brennan she had something to show him. She had brought a document, a passenger manifest from a recent Aeroflot flight that included the names of several Soviet officials traveling under commercial cover. It wasn't highly classified, but it was the kind of thing that would be useful to the CIA for pattern analysis. She said she had taken it on impulse, that she was scared, that she didn't know what to do with it. Brennan took the document. He thanked her. He told her to be careful. He filed a report describing the encounter and the document. The CIA analyzed the manifest. It checked out. The names were real. The travel patterns were consistent with known Soviet intelligence activity. Ludmila had just provided her first piece of genuine intelligence. She was now, in CIA terminology, a cooperating source. What the CIA didn't know was that the document had been prepared by the KGB specifically for this purpose. The names were real, but they were officials whose travel was already known to Western intelligence through other sources. The manifest contained no new information. Its only purpose was to establish Ludmila's credibility, and it worked. Over the next 8 months, Brennan met with Ludmila 6 more times. She provided additional documents, crew schedules, passenger lists, internal Aeroflot memos about security procedures. None of it was high-grade intelligence, but all of it was useful enough to keep the CIA interested. Brennan's reports described her as a valuable, if limited, source, someone who was providing incremental intelligence and who might, with careful handling, provide more. The CIA began paying her. Small amounts at first, passed during their meetings in West Berlin. Ludmila reported every payment to her KGB handlers. The operation was proceeding exactly as planned. The endgame came in April 1980. Ludmila told Brennan she had been approached by a KGB officer who suspected her of having contact with Westerners. She was terrified. She wanted to defect. She needed help getting out. Brennan reported this immediately. The CIA's response was divided. Some officers argued she was a dangle, that the entire relationship had been a setup, that bringing her out would be walking into a trap. Others argued she was genuine, that her fear was real, that abandoning her would mean losing a source and possibly condemning her to arrest. The debate went up the chain. The decision was made to proceed, but with a test. Brennan was instructed to tell Ludmila that the CIA would help her defect, but only if she could provide one piece of high-value intelligence first, something that proved she had access beyond passenger manifests and crew schedules, something that justified the risk. Ludmila agreed. 2 weeks later, she provided Brennan with a document that appeared to be a KGB internal memo about surveillance procedures at Sheremetyevo Airport. It included details about which flights were monitored, which crew members were informants, and which passengers were flagged for special attention. It was exactly the kind of document the CIA would find invaluable. It was also entirely fabricated. The KGB had written it specifically to bait the trap. Brennan reported the document. The CIA analyzed it. It seemed genuine. The decision was made to proceed with the defection. A plan was drawn up. Ludmila would be exfiltrated during a layover in Vienna, a neutral city where the CIA had strong operational infrastructure. The date was set for June 12, 1980. On June 11, 1980, the CIA's Vienna station received a cable from Langley. The defection was aborted. No explanation was given in the initial message, but within hours, the reason became clear. The KGB had leaked the operation to the press. East German newspapers published a story about a CIA plot to kidnap a Soviet flight attendant. The story included details that could only have come from inside the operation: the planned date, the location, even Brennan's cover name. The CIA realized immediately what had happened. Ludmila Petrova had never been a genuine defector. She had been a dangle from the beginning. Every document she provided, every piece of intelligence, every expression of fear and desire to escape had been scripted by the KGB. The entire operation had been designed to expose CIA methods, to identify Brennan and potentially other officers, and to demonstrate that the KGB could manipulate Western intelligence services at will. Brennan was pulled out of Berlin within 48 hours. His career was effectively over. The CIA conducted a damage assessment. The conclusion was humiliating. Ludmila had never provided a single piece of intelligence that wasn't either already known or deliberately false. The money the CIA had paid her had gone straight into KGB coffers. The operation had consumed resources, exposed methods, and compromised at least one case officer, all for nothing. The internal report used the phrase systematic exploitation of gender-based assumptions in threat assessment. In plainer terms, the CIA had been fooled because they didn't take a flight attendant seriously as a trained intelligence operative. The KGB had understood this vulnerability and weaponized it. Ludmila Petrova continued flying for Aeroflot until 1984. She was never publicly identified as a KGB agent. Western intelligence services knew, of course, but there was no appetite for a public confrontation over an operation that had embarrassed the CIA. She was quietly placed on watch lists, which meant she could no longer operate in the same way, but she wasn't arrested or expelled. She simply became too hot to use. In 1984, she left Aeroflot and took a position in the Ministry of Civil Aviation's Personnel Department. She married a mid-level KGB officer in 1986. She had 2 children. She lived quietly in Moscow through the collapse of the Soviet Union, the chaos of the 1990s, and the rise of the new Russian state. She never gave interviews. She never wrote a memoir. When asked about her time as a flight attendant, she said it was interesting work but exhausting, and she was glad to have moved on. The CIA's file on Operation Skyline remained classified until 2003. When it was finally declassified, it revealed the full scope of the program. Ludmila Petrova had been one of at least 37 Aeroflot flight attendants recruited by the KGB for intelligence operations between 1974 and 1985. The program had targeted not just the CIA but also MI6, the BND, and other Western services. It had been remarkably successful, in part because it exploited a blind spot that was as much cultural as operational. The assumption that women in service roles were not serious threats, that intelligence work was a male domain, that flight attendants were too frivolous or too closely monitored to be effective operatives. These assumptions had been baked into Cold War security doctrine, and the KGB had turned them into weapons. What remains unknown is how many operations succeeded that were never detected. The declassified files document cases where the KGB's use of flight attendants was eventually discovered, but counterintelligence officers acknowledged that these are likely only the visible failures. Successful operations, by definition, leave no trace. How many documents were photographed in first-class cabins and never missed? How many conversations in airport bars led to recruitments that were never attributed to their source? How many dead drops were serviced by women in blue uniforms who were waved through security without a second glance? The answers are lost in the archives, if they were ever recorded at all. The broader lesson of Lyudmila Petrova's story is not about espionage tradecraft. It's about the power of invisibility. The KGB didn't need to create elaborate legends or forge decades of backstory. They didn't need to embed operatives in universities or diplomatic missions. They simply placed trained intelligence officers in roles that Western security services had been conditioned to ignore. Flight attendants were supposed to be there. They were part of the infrastructure of international travel. They were young, female, and engaged in work that was coded as subordinate and decorative. And because of that, they could move through secure spaces, interact with targets, and carry materials with a freedom that male officers could never achieve. This wasn't just a KGB innovation. It was a systemic exploitation of how power and threat are perceived. The same assumptions that made flight attendants invisible to counterintelligence made secretaries invisible, translators invisible, cleaning staff invisible. The Cold War intelligence apparatus was designed to detect threats that looked like threats: men in trench coats, diplomats with suspicious contacts, academics with unexplained income. It was far less equipped to detect threats that looked like part of the landscape. The KGB understood this. They didn't fight the system. They used it. In the end, Lyudmila Petrova was neither a hero nor a villain. She was a woman who made a choice: to serve her country in a secret war, to exploit the assumptions of her enemies, to play a role so convincingly that even when the mask came off, people struggled to believe what they were seeing. She was a flight attendant. She served drinks and smiled and moved through the world as if she were exactly what she appeared to be. And for 6 years, that was enough to make her one of the most effective intelligence operatives the KGB ever deployed. Not because she was brilliant, though she was competent. Not because she was ideologically committed, though she mouthed the right phrases, but because she understood the power of being underestimated. Because she knew that the best place to hide is in plain sight. And because she recognized that in a world obsessed with looking for wolves, no one notices the sheep until it's too late. The question that remains is not whether the KGB's use of flight attendants was effective. The declassified record makes that clear. The question is whether the assumptions that made it effective have changed. In the decades since Lyudmila Petrova walked through Sheremetyevo Airport with a microfilm canister in her compact mirror, security services have become more sophisticated, more aware of non-traditional threats, more willing to scrutinize roles and identities that were once taken for granted. But the fundamental dynamic, the tendency to see certain people as background, as scenery, as too ordinary to be dangerous, remains. It's a cognitive bias, and cognitive biases are remarkably persistent. The KGB exploited it in the 1970s. Other intelligence services have exploited it since. And as long as security is built on assumptions about who looks like a threat, there will always be someone who doesn't, walking past the checkpoints with a smile and a suitcase, carrying secrets that no one thought to look for.